What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another weekly edition of the All Aboard newsletter. And one of the things we're going to be talking about today is one of the things that I hear on social media about hiring all the time. And what I'm talking about, it kind of pisses me off, and because I think it's bad advice, and I think it's a great soundbite. I hear a lot of people repeat it all the time, and people are like, "Yeah, that's great." And I think it's a great opportunity to post it on social media and get a bunch of likes and comments and kind of here, dilly dilly type stuff, right? But I think it's bad advice. And what I'm talking about is this idea that you should only hire A players. I think that, to be frank, is bullshit. I think only hiring A players not only is one, a pipe dream, but two, a bad strategy when it comes to building your team. And so I will talk about that today and why I feel that way. So let's dive in. If you feel triggered about that, great. I hope I can change your mind. If you agree, hopefully I can reinforce that decision. So let's dive in and I'll tell you why I feel the way that I do. All right, everybody, let's dive in to why hiring only A players is advice that I believe is misguided. Okay. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And so where I want to start is this idea around sound bites. Okay. It's a great sound bite to talk about only hiring A players and why A players are the best thing to do, right? Or like B players or C players or D players. And Steve Jobs has a very famous quote about this. He says something to the effect of A players hire A players, B players hire C players, C to D, and then before you know it, you got an F player and the whole organization sucks. And actually, I don't really think that's true. I think that if leadership is poor, I think that if leadership is full of C or D players, then yeah, I think the organization is going to have a bunch of employees that maybe are not living up to their full potential. And I think the other question that we have to ask ourselves is what defines an A player? Is an A player something that is a set of intrinsic characteristics and traits in a person? Can they be developed? Can they be built? Or is it about maximizing that potential? Okay. So I think some of the other things that I hear are I only want to hire A players. Okay. And I think there's problems with that. One, can you even find them in your industry or in your business? Second, are you willing to pay them the amount of money that they're going to demand, or are you going to feel like they are entitled or overpaid, right? So I think we live in this world where people want A players but don't want to pay them, or they want A players but they don't want to give them resources, or they think that if they hire an A player it's going to magically fix their business. And the reality is, if those things were true, like if they were going to magically fix your business, wouldn't they maybe just like go out and start their own business? And I know that not everybody is an entrepreneur, but like we got to be rational about these things. Okay. Second, I hear this thing all the time. It's like A players are the people who constantly exceed expectations. And I think, again, we have to define what does constantly exceed expectations mean? Nobody can exceed expectations forever over time. It's just impossible, right? People have good days, they have bad days, they have good weeks, they have bad weeks, they have good months, they have bad months. And if we expect someone to constantly exceed expectations, that is a toxic relationship. I mean, think about us as agency owners. If you are a captive agency, you might have goals by your company that have gone up every year. How does that feel? Not good, right? Like, not every month is going to be a record month. So why do we expect an A player to constantly exceed expectations? I think the third one that we hear a lot is like, put the smartest people in a room together, and if they don't figure it out, well, you can't be faulted. And I think, again, I think that's bullshit. I think a lot of times the smartest people in a room might not really jive together, or they might have big egos, or they might clash. Like, you ever heard of this idea of like there's too many chiefs or there's too many cooks in the kitchen, right? There's all of these things that we can hear. So the sound bites do really well on social media. They do really well in conversation. People go, "Oh my God, that's so true." But in reality, like, does this make sense? I think it doesn't make sense. I am a huge believer in having some stars, AKA maybe A players, and having some role players, AKA B players, and maybe even some C players if they're high potential that we can develop into a B or an A player. I firmly believe that A players are developed. You don't get them off the street. Usually they're already employed, happily so, have a ton of offers, and are getting paid way more than you're willing to offer them. So you've got to develop these A players. So you've got to define what that actually means. But I always like to point back to this man right here on the right. His name is Shane Battier. And if you're not an NBA fan, you may have never heard of him. I think even if you're not an NBA fan, you might have heard of Michael Jordan or Steph Curry or LeBron James or some of these mega stars that have kind of transcended the sport. And Shane Battier is one of the most impressive basketball players of all time, extremely smart. He was called the no stat all-star by Michael Lewis, and there's a reason for that. He didn't show up on the stat sheet, yet he found himself employed by NBA teams for, I think, over a decade. And so how does somebody who doesn't show up on the stat sheet, who doesn't, perform at this highest level like a star, end up on the team? Well, because he might not have been an A player in the traditional sense, right? He was a student of the game, very analytical, extremely smart, and could see things that other people could not. His brain maybe worked in a different way. There's some crazy stories that from back when Miami started their big three, right? They lost their first championship and they brought Shane Battier in. And Shane Battier talked to Chris Bosh, talked to LeBron James, talked to D Wade, and helped them understand how to defend their competition, how to do better on the court that they weren't figuring out themselves. Okay. So he was a student of the game, could see things that others couldn't. He made the rest of his team better, and not only in film practice. There are studies shown that when Shane Battier was on the floor, he didn't have a great stat line, but his whole team's stat line improved and the other team's stat line got worse. He was a catalyst for everybody else to do better. Okay. So we think about this and we say, was he an A player? Well, now that I've told you all this, you're like, yeah, the dude was totally an A player. So that's my point that I'm trying to make here is like, how do you define an A player? I think by a lot of people's standards, Shane Battier is not well known. It would not be considered a traditional star, a traditional A player. He might be a B player or a role player. But when you talk about how much impact he had, people say, oh, well, he is an A player, right? Now we're moving the goalpost. And so I think that's the point I'm trying to make is if we have this rigid, rote definition of what an A player is and we only want to hire A players, well, I don't know that we're going to get the result ultimately that we want. And what I mean by that is over here on the left is the legendary John Wooden, who won like a crazy amount of NCAA basketball championships. And he says, a player who makes the team great is better than a great player. And when we think about that first quote that I talked about, or on that first page that I talked about, is put all the smart people in a room, right? They might not interact well as a team. And so what you want to do is you want to hire A players, sure. You want to hire B players and maybe C players too, as long as cohesively they work well as a team. And so I want to say this, right? Not everybody can be a star, but not everybody needs to be a star. There have been times throughout my career as an agent where I've had people that weren't like a top producer, but they were rock solid, consistent every month. You knew what you were getting from them. They showed up to work. They worked hard. Did they work extra hours? No. But you know what? They hit their goals, exceeded the goals. Maybe they didn't blow the roof off of it, but we knew what we had from them. They didn't complain. We had other guys who maybe even fell short of goals, but they were such knowledgeable, helpful people on the team that they added to the culture, that they were almost like a player coach on the team. Like I remember we had a guy early in my career, he was typically at the bottom of the leaderboard, right? But we kept him in his role because we had all these new young salespeople would say, hey, what about this? What about that? And he would stop what he was doing and he'd help them. He made those other guys better, okay? And so you can build that in to your team. My business partner, Peter, he said something once upon a time that I really liked. He's like, stars burn bright, but they burn out quick. And we've seen that a lot. Sometimes you have somebody come in and they produce at a super high level, 80, 100, 120 items, $100,000 in production, right? And then after 8-10 months, they're ready to get promoted or move out, right? Because they're burned out on the sale. An A player is going to be restless. You might not have them forever. And if you do not have a path for growth for them, you might lose that person. So keep that in mind. And this is important too. Fit matters. Fit can be the difference between an A player and a C player. Somebody might be out of position in your business, might be out of position in your insurance agency. If you have somebody who is taking inbound calls and doing customer service and they don't like that, they're good at it, but they don't like it, and you put them on the outbound, maybe they thrive, and vice versa. Maybe you have somebody who's really great at explaining coverage. You have somebody who is really good at building value and rapport, but when it comes to outbound calling, they hate it and they don't overcome objections or whatever. You might have them out of position, okay? So always keep that in mind, right? If you can afford it or you can place them in a different spot, play to people's strengths. And I think the last thing, right, it's like focus on the impact they can actually achieve in your business. Because guess what? Like they might not add value in the traditional way that you're used to, But if you get them in the right spot, they can add tremendous value. I have another friend who's an agent. He had a guy in sales, wasn't doing great, moved him to like an analyst type role, help him make things more efficient. It was one of the best moves he's ever made. It added so much more to his bottom line than this person cost. If you would have kept him in that sales role, he probably would have got fired. He probably would have left. I have people like that. I have somebody who, has been in my organization for 7 years and is a manager for us now. As a salesperson, they struggled, right? But now they do sales in a different type of format every once in a while and they crush it. So sometimes it's about the job fit. Focus on the impact they can have, not only on their direct numbers, but the impact on the team, the impact on the organization, the impact on you as a business owner. So I'd love to hear what you think about this. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, like let me hear them. Right? Feel free to hit back at me on this. Like I'm always down for a debate, but if you have questions and I can help, we are always here to help. I hope this added some value for you. Until next week. Have a good one.